Well, good afternoon, everybody. Thank you so much for coming in from such a beautiful fall day to sit in the dark with us. I promise quite a bit of light and color and sunshine at some points in this lecture, but thank you for joining us. So we were invited to do this exhibition with the Musée d'Orsay, which is the great museum in Paris that holds the French national collection between 1848 and 1914. And they had invited us to partner with them for a commemoration of the 150th anniversary of the first Impressionist exhibition, which opened on April 15th, 1874, in a rented photographer's studio in one of the newest neighborhoods in Paris. Impressionism is perhaps the most beloved and familiar art movement in the world. And so we recognize the anniversary as an opportunity to celebrate, but also to look more closely at this seminal movement, to learn more about the moment of its inception, and in the process better understand its character and perhaps its popularity. The curatorial team spent the last 5 years reconstructing for the first time what was actually in that first exhibition on the Boulevard des Capucines, but also what the context for the show was: cultural, social, political, economic. Why Paris? Why 1874? Why these artists for an event that art history deems the beginning of modernism? The first Impressionist exhibition took place only 3 years after what Victor Hugo named l'année terrible, the horrible year, which encompassed the Franco-Prussian War, in which Bismarck lured Napoleon III into war and then defeated his army in a humiliating summer of fumbled fighting on the French side. The siege of Paris, in which the Prussians cut off the capital city through one of the coldest winters on record, starving and freezing the citizens while racking their nerves with intermittent bombardments. And the rise of the radical leftist government known as the Commune, that was so threatening to the middle-class status quo that it was suppressed by the French army with an unimaginable savagery. Among the smoldering ruins of the erstwhile City of Light, citizens struggled to get back on their feet. As they had for over 200 years, they turned to artists for meaning, healing, and some intimation of the way forward. Our exhibition shares this history with our visitors, and we hope to give a sense of the centrality of art to the city's communal life. And I'm showing you this amusing composite of caricatures that responded to the explosion of artistic activity in 1874. And the work of critics and caricaturists working for dailies and weeklies and monthly journals was crucial to our research in understanding what was on view and how people were responding to it. And by the way, I would like to plug an exhibition that opened a week ago in the library just here in the East Building. It is entitled Life in the Impressionists' Paris, and it consists of about 40 archival photographs and prints that document this moment in the art world. It's a fantastic show just inside the study center. And then I have a slide here that shows the range of art that we share with you in the exhibition in the West Building and the Mellon Exhibition Galleries. Just about everything that you will see in the show was on view in Paris in the spring of 1874 at one of 2 exhibitions. The official annual Salon, which was held at the imposing Palais de l'Industrie just off the Champs-Élysées. It was the most important contemporary art exhibition in the Western world. It was international, super competitive. It was sensational and spectacular, visited by about 500,000 people from all walks of life who flocked to the venue to ogle some 3,700 works of art by over 2,000 artists. Or at the small independent exhibition about a mile away on the Boulevard des Capucines, mounted by a breakout group who sought more control in presenting their art to the public. It was held in a photographer's studio named Nadar, and you can see his name At nighttime, this thing would light up, but it's NADAR plastered right over the facade of this contemporary building. It was a commercial neighborhood not far from the Gare Saint-Lazare. And this show included approximately 200 works by only 31 artists. They called the group the Société Anonyme des Artistes, which was basically means it's a joint stock company. They had a contract of agreement, they had dues, etc. They received about 3,500 visitors, mostly friends and critics and collectors that visited. It only ran for 1 month. This is the exhibition that would later be recorded as the first Impressionist show, although that moniker for the movement would not be applied until years later. Throughout our exhibition, each object in the show is labeled either Salon of 1874 or Société Anonyme, so that you can have a sense of the difference between the official exhibition and the independent show. Despite the dominant art historical narrative that would have the official salon the location of hopelessly out of touch conventional art, while the first Impressionist show ushered in the art of the future, we think that you will find that artists in both exhibitions strove to make innovative, powerful, moving art that could connect with people. And we hope that you will find, in at least some cases, that their efforts will take your breath away. So Kim and I are going to take you briefly through some of the highlights and themes of our exhibition, which is organized into 10 galleries. Each gallery has its own story, which is told by a wall text. I'm going to show you right now all 4 pictures that are in the first gallery. And the one on the right, which is a recently discovered, recent to the art market, and then quickly acquired by the Musée d'Orsay, in part so that it could be included in our exhibition. It is a painting by an artist called Caballo La Salle. We had never heard of him, I would wager, until this picture came up. And he is in fact credited with being the artist of this work, and he painted most of it. It is a picture of one of the halls in the Salon of 1874, but it was in fact a collaboration. And he invited 6 artists whose work had already been admitted to the Salon way in advance because they were of a certain rank where they didn't have to receive approval from the jury. So the whole system was, well, it was an imperfect system, let's just say. So he knew that all of these artists were going to be able to show those works, and he invited them to come and reproduce on this canvas their own works. So it's a work by 7 artists. Caballo La Salle paints this part, which is a wonderful scene of the kind of folks that you would come upon at the Salon. Fashionable ladies and gentlemen and kids reading and gawking and trying to figure out what's going on. And you get a sense from this picture of the sociability of the Salon space. And then on the left is Monet's painted view from a window in Nadar's studio in which the Société Anonyme was holding their show. And you see the busy modern street, the Boulevard des Capucines, wide sidewalks, uniformly designed apartment buildings lining the street, these buildings up here. And the trees are very young, not quite mature. They were planted maybe just over a decade before. All of it designed by the Second Empire prefect Baron Haussmann during the massive urban renewal project in Paris, which is actually known as Haussmannization. He created, with a huge team and with Napoleon III's approval, essentially created out of the medieval city that Paris was in the 1850s, the modern metropolis that we know today. All over the course of about 20 years. So it was sort of astonishing what happened in Paris, and everything that you see there is brand new in that view. Monet uses quick brushwork as if to echo the accelerated pace of modern life, and in order to capture the traffic patterns of vehicles and pedestrians below. And then midway, right along the side, are these black brushy shapes. They suggest top-hatted figures in the neighboring apartment terrace who, like Monet and like visitors to the Société Anonyme show, and like us viewers of this picture, are observing the hustle and bustle below. The studio was located in a neighborhood that served as a hub of Parisian tourism and leisure activities. It was abuzz by day with luxury shoppers and by night with revelers enjoying the cafes and restaurants and theaters. It was also a financial services center. It was home to the stock exchange, to insurance brokers and banks. And so in a way, it was the perfect location for a show of this new, overtly commercial art. At the official salon, the painting on the left was heralded as the picture of the year, appearing in virtually every critical review, and it won the salon jury's highest honor, the gold medal. It brilliantly updates the genre of history painting, which was the great pride of the French school, widely felt to be in need of regeneration. Orchestrating architecture, period costume, and a sharp narrative wit, the image enthralls with a kind of proto-cinematic power. L'Éminence Grise recreates the palace of Cardinal Richelieu, the Red Cardinal, the virtual ruler of France during the childhood of Louis XIII. Descending the staircase here is Richelieu's chief advisor. He was a Capuchin friar called Father Joseph, known as L'Éminence Grise, or the Gray Cardinal, a term that has come to mean the power behind the throne. Although ostensibly a moment about 17th century French history, the picture could also be seen to address contemporary anxieties of the day regarding the advancing power of the Catholic Church and back channels of authority in the figure of this cunning, unscrupulous, understated monk. And I just love when you get to the galleries, just really, you can revel in the costumes of these obsequious, overly dressed courtiers bowing to this powerful man. And their expressions show a little bit of sort of awe, but also I think they probably despised this guy. You can see that mostly in these two guys, a lot of disdain going on. Gérôme's art epitomized the officially sanctioned academic style, and his paintings with their imperceptible brushwork, meticulous detail, and brilliant effects of color and light commanded huge prices in both France and America. On the right, we have Impression Sunrise, essentially an image of industrial smog in Monet's native town of Le Havre on the northern coast of France, which was, Le Havre was a major industrial port at the time. It was fast growing. It was one of the port gateways to transatlantic trade in goods, including coffee and sugar and cotton, benefiting from the new technology of steamships. It was also a site for tourism from Paris and from England, with its piers teeming with souvenir shops and restaurants. The low-hanging sun burning through the fouled air creates a gorgeous light effect. The atmospheric conditions of this humid early morning scene disperse the light into a purple-green haze tinged with the sun's warm orange. Now, for visitors to the first Impressionist exhibition, unaccustomed to this smudgy, sketchy style, the appearance of this barely legible color field presented as a finished, signed work of art would have been rather disconcerting. Several critics focused on Monet's choice of impression as indicative of the quick summary nature of the artist's painterly vision. Monet's use of broad gestural brushstrokes suggests that the picture was done quickly, on the spot, before the light changed, conveying a sense of instantaneity that was central to Monet's idea of modern art.
As the first room lays out the stakes of the exhibition and the dramatic competition between these two exhibitions, as we move into the second room of the exhibition, we move back in time to 3 years earlier and the events of the Franco-Prussian War, the siege, and the Commune. Although the room is officially called Paris in Crisis, we've always considered it colloquially the trauma room. We thought it was important for people to understand this history, this backstory. Paris is just beginning to emerge from one of its most devastating historical periods. The loss by the French army in the Franco-Prussian War was a devastating blow to the French psyche and to the national confidence. They had never been beaten and humiliated to such a degree. Within a space of months, the army had been defeated on the Eastern Front. Napoleon III had been captured. Then the Prussians laid siege to the city of Paris, the city of light, the most modern and cosmopolitan city of the world. During that terrible, brutal winter, when Parisians cut off from the supply lines, and I'm sure some of us remember COVID and what it was like having those difficult supply lines, were reduced to eating rats and zoo animals to stay alive. All the while, the Prussian army is moving closer and bombarding them until finally, in January of 1871, Paris surrendered to the enemy. And then, of course, you have the rise of the Commune as the working class Parisians joined forces with disaffected members of the National Guard, the men who had defended the city, to form a new liberal and very open government. But this was not the government of France, a new government. The Third Republic had been established. And so in May of 1871, the Versailles army enters the city and touches off a week of brutal civil war, during which as many between 10 and 20,000 Parisians were killed. We still don't even know the exact number, as well as many public buildings were set ablaze. And those ruins still existed in 1874. As you walk the streets, you could turn and see the burned out husk of the Tuileries Palace and other buildings. So this living history, this trauma is still prevalent, and artists were there to record and document and share their experiences, such as photographers like Alphonse Libert, who produced a volume called Ruines de Paris, the ruins of Paris, in which he recorded the destruction wrought during the events of the Commune. Other artists like Maxime Leland created a series of a dozen prints, which he showed in the Salon of 1874, which show not the destruction on the war front, but rather around Paris. Here you see a print that he produced of the Avenue de Bois de Boulogne, in which that once beautiful, lush, tree-lined avenue, the trees had been cut down in order to build fortifications to defend against the Prussian army. And then, of course, there are the artists who were very much on the front lines, such as Auguste Lanson, who actually served in the press corps. He followed around the army and then would create drawings, which were translated into prints and were published in popular journals, in this case, L'Illustration. Just a couple of weeks after this terrible battle, this was actually the Battle of Bazille, which was fought the day before Napoleon III's capture, a devastating French battle. This image was then published and shared with the French public. Then he actually produces a print after it. And then in 1874, he creates this very large painting, which the trauma of this event is amplified through scale and color. Lanson actually had served as part of the Federation of Arts. He was a member of the Commune, and in fact, almost was deported, as many of the communards were, but because of his war service, he was actually released. On the other side, you have Edward Manet, who served in the National Guard in Paris alongside his friend Edgar Degas. So he experienced that terrible siege and in fact wrote letters to his wife who was living safely in Arcachon, talking about the trials and tribulations. He left Paris after the fall of the siege, so he was not present during the Commune, but upon his return, he saw the devastation that was wrought and produced this devastating and disturbing print, Civil War, showing the result of that brutal battle, showing a fallen National Guardsman along with citizens. Now, as from the second room, we go from trauma into drama. Here we see history painting. This is, in fact, the only room in the show that's devoted exclusively to the Salon. Now, as Mary mentioned, history painting was considered it was the apogee of French creation. And it's a very tumultuous moment in the history of history painting. There were those who clamored for change, but also those who looked at history painting as France's greatest art form, the most edifying, uplifting, and moralistic, to help restore that sense of French pride and to remind people of those sort of values that were the foundation of France. But even as artists were looking to historical subjects drawn from French history and mythology and the Bible, in 1874, they're putting their own spin on things. their own experiences inevitably colored the art they create. And so when you understand the events that preceded them, you begin to see the subtle sort of, in many cases, the sub-narratives as well as the obvious narratives, as in William Bouguereau's painting of Homer and his guide, depicting, of course, the famous Greek poet who wrote the Iliad and the Odyssey. Here he is as a blind old man, beset on all sides by these barking, dangerous dogs. But a young man comes and supports him, underscoring the importance of community and of working together towards a better future. While Lawrence Amatadama's painting shows the death of Pharaoh's firstborn son, a scene from the Bible showing the aftermath of the 10th plague in which the firstborn sons of Egypt were struck down. In the back, you can just barely make out the figures of Moses and Aaron, who are coming to ask Pharaoh, will you let my people go now? And of course, in the foreground, there is Pharaoh looking stoic and stony, the body of his own son laid out upon his lap. An experience that would have resonated with French audiences, many of whom had lost sons and husbands to the war. And although Pharaoh looks stoic, when you look at the painting very, very closely, you can see the tears glistening in his eyes, his grief tamped down, but nevertheless present. A similar sense of that emotional quality is evident in Albert Magnan's painting of Departure of the Norman Fleet for the conquest of England. Magnan makes a very interesting choice. He does not highlight the great William the Conqueror, who is setting off to England, where he will claim his throne. He doesn't emphasize the Battle of Hastings, of course, that pivotal battle which won him the throne. Instead, he shows the loved ones left behind, the wives, fathers, lovers, children, who watch and wave as their husbands and loved ones go off, wondering, will they come back? Will they return to us? But there's already in 1874 a shift in the French mood, and that is very evident in paintings like Jules Hélé Delaney's painting of David. Here you have David, who has defeated Goliath, the great towering power, a wonderful metaphor for France, overcoming finally Prussia. This is an image of righteous vengeance. This is revanche, the spirit of revenge that is beginning to build and grow in France. And of course, we're seeing the stage being set ultimately for World War I, and it's already intimated in paintings such as this.
In the next gallery, we shift from subjects that are taken from the past to focus on contemporary life. Both salon artists and those at the Société Anonyme responded to what Charles Baudelaire, the poet of the day, called the epic qualities of modernity, the idea that the moment that they were living in, characterized by speed and ephemerality and an intense sense of the present, was unlike anything that had come before, and that it required a new frame of understanding and a new kind of art. Manet was perhaps the most essential painterly poet of what Baudelaire was calling for. And it is quite striking to note that this painting on the left, The Railway, did not hang with the independent artists at the Société Anonyme, but was at the Salon. The painting bears the hallmarks of Manet's embrace of modernity. The fashionable figures and this fantastic dress, particularly of the young woman, is of the latest cut and color. And that hat, that marvelous hat, which sits sort of impossibly on her head. So fashion, and flashing lights. The sense of a moment captured as a little girl stands to watch a steam locomotive pass by. And the ambiguity of the space that they occupy, you can't quite tell where they are sitting, but it's very cramped as it's kind of as the figures are pushed forward by that iron grate. And finally, the closed blank expression of the young woman herself, Manet's favorite model, Victorine Miron. She wears what we could call her street face, as it were. She's giving nothing away. Manet was the recognized leader of the avant-garde in the 1870s, but he never did exhibit with the Impressionists, reserving his ambitions for the larger public and critical exposure offered by the Salon exhibition. And with this picture, he succeeded, particularly at the hands of caricaturists who delighted in its uncategorizable strangeness. Following the disasters that Kim just described, Parisians slowly, as she described, a kind of shift was happening. And they slowly reclaimed their city as the capital of entertainment, of leisurely pursuits and nightlife. Artists reflected on the city's revitalization and showed chic women and men frequenting theaters and cafes where people from different social classes might mingle. With its focus on newness, fashion became an important way for Parisians to express their modernity in public. Taking as its subject the most spectacularly fashionable venue in town, the opera, and specifically the opera box, the theater box, La Loge, features an aggressively chic courtesan who has lowered her opera glasses in order to fully assume her position as the focus of the viewer's gaze. And we think that she is probably a courtesan. This dress is fantastic, a rather daring décolleté for sure. And the dress, maybe just a little bit over the top. Her face is so heavily made up with that white powder and the red lipstick that she is probably not a proper sort of upper middle class wife. She's probably one of the many paid escorts that frequented these venues. Her client slash partner, meanwhile, surveys others in the audience. He's probably looking for other women, similar kinds of women, similarly on display in other balcony boxes of the opera. So it's all about the gaze and the spectacle. You go to the opera, nobody's paying attention to what's happening on the stage. They're all there to look at each other and to be seen. We have a wonderful wall in the same gallery, in the fourth gallery, devoted to that icon of modernity, La Parisienne, defined here by three artists: Jean-Jacques Henner on the far left, who portrays a dignified bourgeoise in proper street attire. She's wearing a matte black dress. She has that practical umbrella in her right hand, very simple black hat. She wears no makeup. Her part is right down the center of her head. She has wonderful blue details, the kit gloves, these blue gloves, and this bow tied at her neck. But her toilette is very sober, and she exudes a kind of simple confidence and sincerity, a complete lack of coquetry. The picture caused a sensation at the Salon, and she was referred to as the bourgeois sphinx or the modest modern Mona Lisa. Also at the Salon was this painting by Ernst Duez. It is a picture of a wealthy courtesan in her tenue de la rue, or street attire. And she is wearing, again, just a spectacular dress with fur lining and all of these details along the bodice. Her hair is not naturally colored. It is not a natural color. It's so yellow, it would have immediately been recognized as dyed. And then all that white face powder, red lips, and what you can't probably quite see from where you're sitting is this very strange fashion at the time of rouging the ears. And you're not going to see that look on this gal, but she's just taking it all the way. She's dripping in jewels. And my favorite detail, this little puppy who is adorable on a gold leash, but being clutched with that bejeweled hand, as if to say, if you find this attractive and you want to play with me, you may very well end up like this, a little hopeless puppy clutched in my hand on a gold leash. In fact, we know that it was a kind of moralizing painting because it hung with a pendant partner. And this picture is called Splendor. The pendant partner was called Misery, and it pictured a woman decades later, a woman like this, as what might become of her. And it's a painting of an old hag. She's all broken down and miserable and poor. That picture, sadly, has been lost. But definitely sort of moralizing about this issue of these courtesans that had sort of taken over certain aspects of society. And then you have in the middle, Auguste Renoir's painting, titled La Parisienne. And this picture hung in the first gallery of the Société Anonyme at the Independence show. And this is a painting that is not so much about her. She has a rather kind of vacant expression, but she's wearing a beautifully cut dress of the latest fashion, and then very assertively and specifically blue. Indigo dye had traditionally been a very expensive dye, so it would cost a lot to have a dress completely blue. But in recent years, the fashion industry had come up with a commercial artificial dye that was blue. And so all of a sudden you saw everything came out in blue. It was called indigo manie. And so she's got a blue hat, blue gloves, the whole dress is blue. It just sort of screams fashionability. Young, fashionable, and savvy, La Parisienne became French culture's central protagonist. She was a fantasy figure who served as an international icon of modernity. In art, she infiltrated the new, largely masculine social spaces designed for leisure and entertainment, like dance halls and cafes. Displaying indomitable chic and sophistication, La Parisienne shifted understandings about French womanhood and female independence, but also fed into the rise of French cultural importance and trend setting.
Even as artists were turning their sights on the modern world outside their doors, they also began to explore what modern life looked like in domestic spaces, the family life, the artist studio, the places they inhabited that were private, but nevertheless allowed them to also experiment with and celebrate modernism. This is certainly true in the painting by Claude Monet, The Luncheon. You'll notice the date on this painting. It's 1868 to 1869. So not necessarily of the 1874 moment. There's a reason for that. Monet had actually submitted this painting to the Salon of 1870, where it was rejected. Not entirely surprising. That's a very big, ambitious painting. When you see it, you will be dazzled. It is almost life-size. It is that large. However, by 1874 and the Société Anonyme exhibition, when Monet finally has the opportunity to choose his own works and to not have to grapple with a jury and their limited thoughts of what made good art, he includes this painting. So this painting was on the wall in the first Impressionist show, along with Impression Sunrise. It seems like a very strange sort of cohabitation, but in fact, it says a great deal about Monet, about his ambition, but also his appreciation and love of this painting. This was a major statement piece, and its inclusion in that exhibition was also a statement. The fact that he actually priced it at 5,000 francs was the most expensive painting offered in the first Impressionist show. Spoiler alert, it did not sell. But that was unfortunate, but you have to admire the man's ambition, which is very much on display. And it's a painting that does not reflect real life, but rather is aspirational. Here you have a beautifully appointed bourgeois interior, and he paints the canvas so that you have a view down, so you can see this sumptuous table with the pork cutlets and potatoes, this wonderful crusty bread, the grapes, the wine. And then, of course, in the foreground, this empty seat with the newspaper, which obviously belongs to the artist, while seated behind him at the table, of course, is his mistress and future wife, Camille Pissarro, and their son, Jean. And of course, a servant, because that would be right and proper for a good bourgeois home. And this woman in black, whose identity we don't know, and of course, is open to interpretation. But clearly, she is visiting the family. It's a wonderful, warm, and welcoming scene, but it didn't reflect Monet's reality per se, although Monet was a notorious spendthrift. Every time he got money, he immediately spent it on things like imported wine and servants. He wanted to live this life. And so this is kind of his, dream laid out for the public. We have a very different kind of view of the domestic world in the works of Berthe Morisot. Morisot was the only woman to participate in the first Société Anonyme exhibition. Maybe. There's another very mysterious figure which we will not talk about today because she's not well known and present in the show. But Morisot it was a very big leap of faith for Morisot. She had actually been relatively successful in the Salon. She had never been rejected at the Salon. And Manet, who was a friend, had cautioned her against throwing in her fate with these these men, but she decided to. And in fact, she is one of the stars of that first exhibition, and indeed one of the stars of the current exhibition. She's very well represented with extraordinary works. And here you have one of her most famous paintings, a painting that shows her beloved sister Edma following the birth of her daughter Jean. It's a wonderful psychological portrait of motherhood. It lacks the expected sentimentality. And rather, when you look at her face, there's a certain ambivalence. There is tenderness, yes, but there's also anxiety, fear, that weight of responsibility that comes with parenthood. Morisot is very good at communicating the subtle and complex inner lives of women, which she does so beautifully in this painting.
So after that horrible year in Paris, traumatized citizens flocked to the railways to escape the damaged city, in which many of them had been trapped during the war. They were in search of open air and a more relaxed pace in the soothing environment of the French countryside. Traffic through the city's busiest train station, which was the Gare Saint-Lazare, ballooned as Parisians made their way northwest of the capital, with the rail line's ultimate destination, the burgeoning resort centers on the Channel coast, places like Trouville and Deauville. Along the same line, closer to the city, long-established communes or villages were transformed into Parisian suburbs, several of which became associated with the Impressionist painters who worked and painted in them. We're talking about places like Argenteuil and Bougival and Vétoil. And leisure would become a central subject, perhaps the central theme of Impressionism, accompanied by a style that was itself seemingly spontaneous and improvisatory, informal and easy, and sensually pleasurable. And I'm showing you here on the right a painting by Edgar Degas, who was fascinated by the contemporary craze for horse racing, a spectator sport that had been imported from England. He produced a large body of racing pictures, and this one includes 2 sprinting riders and a few scattered fans way off here to the left in the distance. The main subject, though, is an intimate family moment. And what we have here is one of the spectator carriages that's pulled off to the right. And it's an open carriage. And there is a wet nurse, a hired sort of wet nurse here, feeding the son of the family, the brand newborn son. This is the Valpinson family. They were very friendly with Degas. Daddy is sitting up here watching this event. Mommy is sort of hovering here in the shade, and the family dog is also sitting there and watching this event. The subject of breastfeeding in contemporary life, as you can imagine, was highly conventional in art, and you can't imagine this painting being selected for display at the official Salon exhibition, for instance. Amazing thing. And then the painting on the left by Giuseppe Di Nittis, he is one of our swing artists. He's one of the 12 that actually showed in both exhibitions that year, at the Salon and at the Société Anonyme. He had immigrated from Italy in 1867 and achieved remarkable market success with his paintings. Like his close friend Manet, Di Nittis exhibited primarily at the higher profile Salon, but any one of his pictures, steeped in the currency of contemporary Parisian life, could have hung in the Impressionist exhibitions. His subjects, their relationship to the immediacy of photography, his bright palette and lively touch were very much in line with the new painting, and critics actually associated him with Impressionism. And here you have a painting, you see it says exhibition at the bottom, Salon refused. He had submitted it to the jury along with 2 other pictures, and this one was refused by the jury. Who knows why? We have one of his little pictures that was admitted and hung at the Salon, and then we weren't able to get the third that was actually, I think, slightly more unusual, that was admitted. But what you do have here in this refused picture are 3 seriously fashionable women. They are Parisiennes. They are walking on the boulevard of the Bois de Boulogne, this newly affluent neighborhood that the artist himself lived in. And you can see that this wonderful, crisp, newly cut street, the broad sidewalk made for promenading and showing off. Way off in the distance is the Arc de Triomphe. So this is a neighborhood beyond, away from the city center on the other side of the Arc de Triomphe, near the new city park that Haussmannisation had created called the Bois de Boulogne. Kim talked about Berthe Morisot, who really is one of the stars of our exhibition, and the way in which she alone among the Impressionists was able to convey for us the complex inner lives of women at the time. Reading, the painting on the left, was one of 4 oil paintings that she exhibited, and it is exemplary of her interest in both the bourgeois modern women and the airy idyll of suburban landscape. So central to the modernist movement of Impressionism, landscape painting posed a challenge, of course, for upper middle class female artists. Their movements were strictly circumscribed by the contemporary mores of a patriarchal society. In fact, the bulk of Morisot's oeuvre consists of domestic interiors, and the landscape locations that she does approach with her oils and watercolors were determined by family relations. In the case of the picture on the right, it's the summer of 1873, and she had gone off to visit her beloved sister Edma, and Edma's family on the northern coast of France is where she was living. Hide and Seek shows her sister and her niece Jeanne, who are enjoying the outdoors. The 2 sisters had trained together as artists, as young women. And Edma's abandonment of their shared artistic dream in 1869, choosing marriage and motherhood instead of an artistic career, was a rupture that both women mourned. But Berthe's regular visits to Edma as she followed her naval officer husband from station to station around France afforded Berthe the opportunity to travel outside Paris and to paint landscapes.
Religious painting might seem to be an odd inclusion in an exhibition that ostensibly is about the birth of Impressionism. But in reality, in this Impressionist moment of 1874, religion played a very important role in art and society. Following the events of the Franco-Prussian War and the Commune in particular, the new Third Republic government of France took a very sharp conservative turn in its morality and in the rise of the power of the Catholic Church. Catholicism was, of course, essentially the national religion of France and had always played an important role. But after the turmoil of recent years, there was a strong sense of the importance of church and faith. But artists who turned to religious painting did not necessarily continue with the tradition and the way painting is done before. They were searching for new ways of expressing and depicting faith. For example, this wonderful painting by Ludovic Lepic. He's another one of our 12 swing painters represented in the show, both in Salon and Impressionist works. These are the 2 wings of an enormous triptych. When you see these paintings, you'll be, I think, quite stunned by their scale. And the scene is that of the biblical flood. Sadly, the middle painting and a crowning lunette have been lost to us. We do have a print in the show that was done shortly after by another artist by the name of Noël Masson, and with collaboration with Lepic, which shows the entire composition. But these 2 panels, which do survive, which actually belong to the artist's descendants, which is also very exciting, show the aftermath of the flood. When the waters began to recede, Noah sent out a raven and a dove to seek out signs of life. The raven never returned, but the dove returned, clutching an olive branch in its beak, a sign of the covenant of God, that all was forgiven and that life might start anew. These are extraordinary paintings and very unusual because rather than showing the traditional subjects, expectations of Noah building the ark, it is this aftermath which focuses on this almost antediluvian landscape and the animals. It's very lush and very strange. Now, there was one artist among the Impressionists who did explore religious subjects, and that's Edward Brandon. Edward Brandon was a Jewish artist who had actually spent many years in Rome. That's where he met Edgar Degas, who was the one who invited him to exhibit. Degas was the great recruiter for the first Impressionist show. He was bringing in lots of people into the mix, including Berthe Morisot and almost Edma Morisot. Brandon, when he was in Rome, of all things, although he was Jewish, he actually was decorating a Catholic church, the Church of St. Bridget, which was a Swedish Catholic church. But upon his return to Paris in the 1870s, he begins to focus his attention almost exclusively on scenes of Jewish life, and specifically Jewish religious life. And so the painting we have in the exhibition, I will be very clear, it was not one of the paintings that was shown in 1874. We did locate one. It's a very large canvas belonging to Philadelphia Museum of Art. Unfortunately, it's in very, very bad state. It could not be lent, but we wanted his story to be included. And so we have borrowed this other painting, which is comparable in terms of its subject, if not necessarily in its scale. Two more religious works which show you the breadth and range of religious depictions. On the left, Jean-Jacques Henner's beautiful and moving Good Samaritan. It's a painting that the Salon critics greatly admired for its simplicity and its honesty and authenticity, the sensibility that it conveys in this very stark, very subdued subject. The power, though, of the emotion really spoke to people in 1874. And on the right, a different kind of religious painting. I will confess, this is one of my very favorite paintings in the show by Edward Danton, which shows a monk sculpting a wooden crucifixion. I mean, a very odd painting that merges religious painting with genre scenes of everyday life, in which you have this monk standing in a studio surrounded by the signs of both his vocations, that as a servant of God and as an artisan. And I love, in fact, how you see the legs of the Christ almost mimic those of the Dead Samaritan. It's a very strange painting. Yet this was a painting that was actually admired by the Salon jury, so much so that Danton won a third-class medal, and the painting was acquired by the French government for the state collections. Now, continuing on this vein of tradition, this is a very important topic in 1874. What is the role of tradition? Do we move forward? Do we look back? And when we think of Impressionism, we do think of modern art as being progressive, about looking forward, moving forward, turning the back on the past. But that was not the reality at all. In fact, that narrative, too, is infinitely more nuanced and complex. Many artists involved in the Impressionist group held deep regard for historical art and allowed it to inform what they did. One of those artists in particular was Félix Bracquemond. Now, when we think of Impressionism, we also think paintings. But the reality was the first Impressionist show was incredibly diverse in terms of the media on display. There weren't just paintings. There were sculptures, prints, pastels, even works in enamel. Bracquemond was one of the stars, and in fact was one of sort of the main players in the early Impressionist shows. He exhibits for several years with the group. In 1874, he showed 31 etchings, many of which show scenes drawn directly from historical subjects, such as his wonderful etching of the Spring by the neoclassical master Jean-Auguste Dominique Ingres. It's a very modern twist on historic work, but also the fact that he is engaging in etching. In the mid-19th century, there was a revival and interest in the medium of etching. By the early 19th century, etching had kind of fallen out of favor and was viewed largely as a purely mechanical, reproductive medium with no creativity, no versatility. But artists like Bracquemond and Lepic and others saw etching as an opportunity to be inventive, to express themselves. And so you have this whole new school of thinking around printmaking. And then, of course, you have sculpture. You have this incredible bust by Auguste Autain, which is a bust of Jean-Auguste Dominique Ingres, again, the great neoclassical painter. Autain's presence is very important because he's the one who put sculptor in the name of the group. The full name was the Anonymous Society of Painters, Sculptors, and Engravers, etc. So etc. covers everything else. And so here you have, he was 64 years old when he exhibited with the Impressionists. So not a young man, not a young buck trying to make his way. He had been a very successful artist. He had won the Prix de Rome. He had studied under Ingres at the Villa Medici in Rome. He had had state commissions. He had all the papers, but he had also been a part of the Commune. He was had very liberal political views. He was imprisoned for a time after the Commune, eventually released, but his politics made it very clear that he would be no longer welcome in the Salon. So he threw in with this young group of artists, and in fact was the treasurer of that group. So this, I think, is probably the most surprising thing you will be seeing in the current exhibition.
In 1874, landscape painting was shifting from a marginal genre, supplementary to figural work, to the center of avant-garde practice. A burgeoning art market favored pleasant, accessible works and painting technology in the form of tin tubes of paint, small supply boxes, and collapsible stools was making the practice more portable. And so artists were more and more taking their trade outdoors. Modern railways spread across the nation, enticing artists on picturesque voyages of discovery. And they shared their images with city dwellers back at home, hungry for rural connection. Alongside the kinds of history paintings at the 1874 that Kim was showing you, landscape painting also took on the burden of national healing and reassurance. Paintings in this room reminded the French of their agricultural foundations and the stable rural backbone of the nation. And I'm showing you here this marvelous epically scaled painting by Jules Breton. There is a barefoot young woman in the dress of remote Brittany to the far northwest of Paris. She's laying on her stomach. It's a little dark here, but she has sort of cast aside her task of the moment, which is making yarn with her spindle. And she's looking out at the weather-beaten coast, fabled for its Celtic origins and resistance to modernization. Large in size for maximum impact, the image addresses an urban yearning for space and solitude and communion with wild, raw nature. Jules Breton was considered a cutting-edge contemporary painter, working in an innovative style called naturalism, and his rustic scenes celebrating the rural French would become extremely popular among American art collectors, as well as those of his native France. Except for its large size, this painting by Daubigny could just as easily have hung at the first Impressionist exhibition. Daubigny uses loose brushwork, a bright palette, and a sense of immediacy to create a vivid, fresh springtime scene. He had been a landscapist his entire life, and he had received the highest official honors. In fact, he was sitting on the jury of the Salon of 1874, where he tried, without a lot of success, to make way for the emerging landscapist that would break away and show with the independence. In the final room, we have is entirely dominated by landscapes. Although fewer in number than figural works at the Société Anonyme show, landscapes like those in this room came to define the Impressionist movement. Working on mostly white canvases, the artists crafted sophisticated harmonies with bright pigments to achieve pictures that shimmered with colorful light. Critics described the effect as decorative, emphasizing sensual pleasure and visual beauty over more cerebral moral ideas. And they recognized, not without a degree of trepidation, that these artists were leaving behind more socially and politically engaged figural works. I'm showing you on the left a painting by Camille Pissarro, who suffered more than many of his artist compatriots from the tribulations of war and unrest in France. His family abandoned their home in Louveciennes, a western Parisian suburb, during the Franco-Prussian War of 1870, and he took them off to London to wait out the disaster. Prussian troops commandeered it and not only destroyed the furnishings, but most devastatingly, much of the art that he left behind. Hard times were not new to the artist. He was a Jewish immigrant from the Caribbean, from the Danish West Indies. He had little inherited wealth and a rapidly growing family. He struggled most of his life to make a living and advance his career, but he never stopped painting. He painted every day. It seemed to sustain him by providing him with a consistent source of joy. In this picture, Hoarfrost, He focuses on the diagonals of a row of leafless trees behind him. We're talking about these wonderful shadows being cast, crisscrossing the cut furrows of the agricultural field. All the while, this hoarfrost, this early morning frost, is glittering in the glacial air, knitting the scene together in a color harmony of yellows, blues, and greens. It is a beautiful painter. I encourage you to spend quite a bit of time just standing with it and letting it work on you. The painting on the right by Cézanne, Cézanne had actually, prior to this moment, been consumed by scenes of sort of romantic psychodramas involving sex and violence. He was really a complicated, intense, tortured guy. Pissarro takes him in 1872 outside by the scruff of his neck and sets him to start painting landscapes. So they have a painting campaign together in the country. And under Cézanne's tutelage, under Pissarro's tutelage, Cézanne is able to refocus his intense energy on color and brushwork, devising unconventional ways to convey a sense of space and volume on the two-dimensional surface of the canvas. Here, the compositional lines of the roof edges and the trees and the road powerfully converge to this point. And we're talking about sort of all lines coming to this extraordinary sort of anchor around which the palette is so varied, brightly hued, and the brushstrokes are so thick. He clearly worked at this painting for a long time, densely accreted. These formal concerns about picture making would inform and sustain Cézanne's painting practice for the next 3 decades. Now, visitors seeing these pictures for the first time might have had difficulty processing them. They were used to art in museums that was covered in yellow-brown varnish, and contemporary artists, as you've seen at the Salon, generally used a more subdued palette and painted on dark-toned canvases. So these pictures were sort of hard to register. The infamous critic Louis Leroy, who is credited with coining the group's eventual name Impressionist, a moniker he intended as negative, articulated some of the ways in which these paintings were visually shocking in his reviews of the show. But he also may have helped us identify the work on the right by Alfred Sisley as being the one that was in the first Impressionist exhibition. These titles are not so definitive and do not necessarily point to particular works. Alfred Sisley painted a lot of trees in flower in Louveciennes. But Louis Leroy refers to a beautiful little scene of trees in flower with a little tree sort of dancing at the light, barely there. And we think that is this little tree. So we've decided just in the last 2 years that this is probably the picture that was actually in the first Impressionist exhibition. It comes from a private collection in Texas, and you can imagine how thrilled the owner is to discover that his work is probably the one. Sisley exhibited 6 landscapes at the inaugural exhibition of the Société Anonyme in 1874. Many of them were river landscapes like the one on the left, which appears to be serene and straightforward. But recent scholarship has reframed it and other river scenes by Sisley as meditations on the dramatic intersection of nature and society and industry. The Seine at Port Marly depicts a 17th century hydraulic system that had undergone recent renovation, demonstrative of the ongoing industrialization of the River Seine, the main artery in that part of France. With a light, responsive brush, Sisley makes of this modern river scene a carefully structured composition that organizes his beautiful play of harmonized pastel colors. I think he really is one of the stars of the show. We have a full wall of his works. They're absolutely ravishing. And we close where we started, back to Monet and his English Channel home of Le Havre. This marvelous, slightly panoramic picture of the lively harbor, boats and fishermen, vendors and tourists out for a walk, rendered in his dancing, flickering brush, is really one of the stars of the show, and it offers a nice bookend to Impression Sunrise. From his place as an emerging young artist, almost completely unknown in 1874, Monet would become among the most popular artists of all time. replacing artists like Gérôme and Bouguereau at the pinnacle of celebrity. The year 1874 marks the official art historical start of art's move from the center of public discourse, harnessing tradition to grapple with broad social and political issues of the day, to a more private individual practice, expressive of personal perspectives and sensations. This new painting would go by various names, including independence and intransigence, until critics and art historians finally settled on Impressionists and Impressionism. After their first exhibition, the independent group continued to struggle to organize exhibitions and sell their work. Their eighth and final exhibition took place in 1886. And the following year, the dealer Paul Ruel established a bricks and mortar foothold in New York to capitalize on the growing American market for contemporary French art. And this is when he began to have some real success with Impressionism, some of which he passed on to the artists with which he worked. But he succeeded in seeding private collections with spectacular paintings that would eventually build the great American museum collections of Impressionism across the United States. The story of Impressionism has a crucial American chapter then, and we are so pleased to have the chance to celebrate its anniversary here at the National Gallery. We look forward to seeing you in the show. Thank you very much for your time.